Welcome to Star Certification International's introductory session to PCI DSS compliance. The payment card industry, PCI, refers to the segment of financial industry related to automated teller machines, point-of-sale terminals, credit, debit, prepaid and electronic money cards, etc. PCI basically comprises all organizations that store, process, or transmit cardholder data. The Council's founding members, American Express, Discover Financial Services, JCB International, MasterCard, and Visa Incorporated, have agreed to incorporate the PCI Data Security Standard, PCI DSS, as part of the technical requirements for each of their data security compliance programs. PCI Security Standard is a set of technical and operational requirements for organizations accepting or processing payment transactions, for software developers and manufacturers of applications and devices used in those transactions. These standards are designed to ensure better protection of cardholders' data, and compliance to these standards are governed by the PCI Security Standards Council. PCI DSS stands for Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. PCI DSS is a widely accepted set of policies and procedures intended to optimize the security of credit, debit and cash card transactions, protect cardholders against misuse of their personal information. All member organizations that issue or acquire information from cards with the Visa, MasterCard, American Express and Discover logos are required to comply with a range of information security requirements that are covered by PCI DSS. PCI DSS is for all those who work with and are associated with cardholder data storing, processing, or transmitting. It includes merchants of all sizes, financial institutions, point-of-sale vendors, as well as hardware and software developers who create and operate the global infrastructure for processing payments. How does it work? The PCI DSS standard sets common requirements for securing card information, and lays out a range of controls relating to auditing, scanning and assessment. There are several advantages to becoming PCI DSS compliant. Firstly, compliance to PCI DSS ensures security in business data and protection of all stakeholders' information from cyber hackers and thieves. Secondly, ensuring compliance to PCI DSS and promoting the same to your customers makes it clear to your clients that you are serious about security, and you're taking every precaution to keep their payment data safe. It boosts their confidence. Thirdly, it is your responsibility to ensure customer data is safe while it's in your possession, and compliance to PCI DSS ensure this. Fourthly, PCI DSS provides a baseline of security requirements that help businesses know what to do and where to start on their security program. Fifthly, data breaches can cost you a lot, both in terms of money and customer confidence. The cost of replacing credit cards, paying fines, and paying compensations for what the customers have lost, have proved to be really huge, and most organizations never recover from the aftermath of such breaches. PCI DSS protects your business from such breaches. Is it mandatory to be PCI DSS compliant? Although PCI DSS must be implemented by all entities that process, store or transmit cardholder data, formal validation of PCI DSS compliance is not mandatory for all entities. Currently, both Visa and MasterCard require merchants and service providers to be validated according to the PCI DSS. However, it is to be noted that in the event of a security breach, any compromised entity which was not PCI DSS compliant at the time of breach will be subject to additional card scheme penalties, such as fines. PCI DSS describes the requirements that apply for all merchants transmitting, handling or storing card data. There are 12 requirements, and we will now take you through these requirements. Firewalls control the transmission of data between an organization's trusted internal networks and untrusted external networks, as well as traffic between sensitive areas of the internal networks themselves. Requirement 1 of the PCI DSS requires systems to use firewalls to prevent unauthorized access. Where other system components provide the functionality of a firewall, they must also be included in the scope and assessment of this requirement. The default settings of many commonly used systems are well known, easily exploitable, and often used by hackers to compromise those systems. Vendor-supplied default settings must therefore be changed and unnecessary default accounts disabled or removed before any system is installed on a network. This applies to all default passwords, without exception. If firewalls are correctly implemented according to Requirement 1, they should also comply with Requirement 2. The storage of cardholder data should be kept to a minimum and appropriate data retention. Disposal policies, procedures and processes should be implemented. Certain data, such as the full contents of the chip or magnetic strip, the card verification number or the personal identification number, should never be data is stored. It should be stored securely. Encryption, truncation, masking and hashing are critical components of cardholder data protection. Without access to the proper cryptographic keys, encrypted data will be unreadable and unusable by hackers even if they manage to circumvent other security controls. Cryptographic keys should therefore be stored securely and access to them should be restricted to the fewest custodians necessary. Other data protection methods should also be considered. Strong cryptography and security should be used to safeguard sensitive cardholder data during transmission over open, public networks that could easily be accessed by malicious individuals. Examples of open, public networks include the Internet, wireless technologies, general packet radio service and satellite communications. Industry best practices must be followed to implement strong encryption for authentication and transmission. Security policies and procedures for encrypting the transmission of cardholder data must be documented and made known to all affected parties. Antivirus software capable of detecting, removing and protecting against all known types of malware, for example viruses, worms and trojans, must be used on all systems to protect them from threats. Antivirus mechanisms must be maintained and kept actively running and should only be disabled if formally authorized for a specific purpose. Requirement 6. Many security vulnerabilities are fixed by patches issued by the software vendors. Organizations should therefore establish a process to identify security vulnerabilities and rank them according to their level of risk, and should then install relevant security patches within a month of their release in order to protect against the compromise of cardholder data. All software applications, whether developed internally or externally, should be developed securely in accordance with the PCI DSS, based on industry standards and/or best practices, and should incorporate information security throughout their entire development lifecycle. Requirement 7. Exploiting authorized accounts and abusing user privileges is one of the easiest ways for hackers to gain access to a system. It is also one of the most difficult types of attack to detect. Documented systems and processes should therefore be put in place to limit access rights to critical data, based on the need to know and according to authorized personnel's clearly defined job responsibilities. Access control systems should deny all access by default. Need to know is defined in the PCI DSS as when access rights are granted to only the least amount of data and privileges needed to perform a job. Requirement 8. The ability to identify individual users not only ensures that system access is limited to those people with the proper authorization, it also establishes an audit trail that can be analyzed following any incident. Documented policies and procedures must therefore be implemented to ensure proper user identification management for non-consumer users and administrators on all system components. All users must be assigned a unique ID, which must be managed according to specific guidelines. Controlled user authentication management, for example the use of passwords, smart cards or biometrics, should also be used and, as 3/4 of all network intrusions exploit weak or stolen passwords, two-factor authentication must be used for remote network access. Requirement 9. Electronic data breaches are not the only source of data loss. Physical access to systems should also be limited and are monitored by the use of appropriate controls. Procedures should be implemented to distinguish between on-site personnel and visitors, and physical access to sensitive areas. For example, server rooms, data centers etc., should be restricted accordingly. All media should be physically secured and stored. Its access and distribution should be controlled. Media should be destroyed in specific ways when no longer required. Devices that capture payment card data via direct physical interaction with the card must be protected from tampering and substitution, and should be periodically inspected to detect tampering or substitution. An up-to-date list of these devices should be maintained. Requirement 10. The use of logging mechanisms is critical in preventing, detecting and minimizing the impact of data compromises. If system usage is not logged, then potential breaches cannot be identified. Secure, controlled audit trails must therefore be implemented that link all access to system components with individual users and log their actions, including access to cardholder data, actions taken by individuals with root or administrative privileges, access to audit trails, invalid logical access attempts, use of and changes to identification and authentication mechanisms, the initializing, stopping or pausing of audit logs, and creation and deletion of system-level objects. Audit trail history should be retained for at least a year, with a minimum of 3 months logs immediately available for analysis. Logs and security events should be regularly reviewed to identify anomalous or suspicious activity. Requirement 11. New vulnerabilities are regularly found and exploited, so it is essential that system components, processes and custom software are regularly tested to ensure the continuing utility of security controls. Documented processes must be implemented to detect and identify all unauthorized wireless access points on a quarterly basis. Internal and external network vulnerability scans must be performed by qualified personnel at least quarterly and after any significant change in the network. For example, new system component installations, changes in network topology, firewall rule modifications and product upgrades. Intrusion detection, prevention techniques should be used to detect and/or prevent network intrusions, and a change detection mechanism should be employed to perform weekly critical file comparisons, and to alert personnel to unauthorized system modifications. Requirement 12. To comply with the PCI DSS, organizations must establish, publish, maintain and disseminate a security policy, which must be reviewed at least annually and updated according to the changing risk environment. A risk assessment process must be implemented to identify threats and vulnerabilities. Usage policies for critical technologies must be developed. Security responsibilities for all personnel must be clearly defined, and a formal awareness program must be implemented. Organizations must also implement an incident response plan so that they can respond immediately to any system breach. Compliance is determined based on how your organization stores, processes, and/or transmits cardholder data across your infrastructure. Compliance is based on level and type. Level is based on the number of transactions performed in a 12-month period. Type is defined by how your organization takes credit cards. Levels are based on the number of transactions. Visa defines them as follows. Types are defined by how your organization takes credit cards, and are broken down as follows. Card not present merchants, imprint only merchants or standalone dial-up terminal merchants, Merchants with payment application connected to the Internet. Merchants using web-based. Other merchants. PCI DSS goals and some of the requirements to achieve these goals. To build and maintain a secure network, firewall is required and system defaults passwords must be changed. To protect cardholder data, all transmission of cardholder data must be encrypted and antivirus softwares should be updated. And assessment to determine the vulnerability of the management program to be conducted annually. To implement strong access control measures. Cardholder data access should be controlled on a need-to-know basis. Employees should be provided with unique ID to restrict computer access and physical access. All access to network should be tracked and monitored on a regular basis. An information security policy should be created to address the policies and procedures. The organization need to maintain a continuous compliance through the process of assess, remediate, report. The 5 best practices of PCI DSS compliant are: verify that there is a formal process for testing and approval of all network connections and changes to firewall and router configurations. Documentation and business justification for use of all services, protocols, and ports allowed, including documentation of security features implemented for those protocols considered to be insecure. Requirement to review firewall and router rule sets at least every 6 months. 4. Restrict inbound and outbound traffic to that which is necessary for the cardholder data environment. Limit inbound internet traffic to IP addresses within the demilitarized zone. Do not allow any direct connections inbound or outbound for traffic between the internet and the cardholder data environment. Now let's look into the 7 PCI DSS best practices to comply for network security. Since PCI DSS is the de facto standard that any company processing credit cards must comply to, IT managers and PCI internal auditors continually align their enterprise security program to achieve this goal. Before getting into the PCI DSS requirement details, it's good to look at what's worked in many enterprises to enforce and remediate PCI network security compliance. 1. Create a clear separation of PCI data, PCI application, and PCI web within the network. 2. Ensure that you have a network change workflow process in place that meets PCI requirements. 3. Ensure that every network change has a complete audit trail with the who, what, when, and why. 4. Validate every network change with the following. Analyze the change for risks as defined in your security policy. Get approval by the business owner. Ensure the changes are implemented according to the PCI-compatible network change workflow. 5. Ensure that firewalls protecting PCI zones work with the following guidelines. Every rule has a comment. Every rule has a log. No rules with risky services, unencrypted. Delete unused rules. 6. Ensure every firewall rule is documented properly with the following info: business justification, business owner, application name. 7. Ensure that you keep firewall logs for at least 12 months. Points to ponder on the importance of PCI DSS. PCI DSS compliance is not optional. Protecting credit card information is a serious matter requiring considerable effort. It's not about complying with some arbitrary industry standard. These are reasonable security controls necessary for properly protecting confidential information. This introductory session to PCI DSS compliance was brought to you by Star Certification International Private Limited.